Have you ever wondered? Ever wondered?
Welcome to Have You Ever Wondered? I'm Cardine Cross, author and teacher. Our next episode will explore the amazing phenomenon of near-death experiences. NDEs have been reported in cultures throughout history. We find them even in the medical literature in the 18th century. These reports have greatly increased in recent years, and some speculate it's because the stigma of reporting an NDE has faded. Greater awareness of NDEs through books, documentaries, and media coverage may be leading to individuals recognizing their own NDE experience. The scientific community's growing interest in NDEs could also help. And there are many medical doctors now even reporting their own near-death experiences. And the advances in medical technology and improved resuscitation techniques have also resulted in improved survival rates. So most of us have heard NDE similarities. The list is long. Being greeted by loved ones, seeing bright light, traveling through a tunnel, the feelings of overwhelming peace and love, being in a place of indescribable beauty, and having a panoramic light view, and not wanting to return to Earth. So our next guest, Rob Gentile, had many of these experiences during his near-death experience. And I must say, I have read many near-death experiences, and I found Rob's to be one of the most touching and detailed and beautiful. So Rob is the son of Italian immigrants. His father worked at a steel mill, and Rob grew up in Aliquippa, Pennsylvania. Rob spent his career as a sales engineer in the steel industry while married to his wife, Melanie, for over 30 years. Together, they have devoted themselves to their special needs daughter, Maria, who is in her 20s and who Rob calls a pure spirit. So it is wonderful to have you here today, Rob. I want to say right from the beginning that I have read many near-death experience books, and yours is by far one of the top books I've read. It is so compelling, well-written, and also the detail is just exquisite. And so I want to, right out of the gate, ask you, how were you able to capture the detail of your book or of your life and your near-death experience so well?
Well, thank you. First of all, thank you for that lovely introduction, Carlene. I'm honored to be here, share my story with you. Thank you so much for having me.
Sure.
Well, I could tell you that what I did was Maria started to present. We knew that Maria was going to have some issues at about 18 months.
Wow.
So I decided early on to begin journaling. And I never thought it would last. She's 27 years old. I didn't think it would last 27 years. Yeah. But I began journaling this because I knew it was going to be a marathon with Maria. So, it was almost from a medical perspective to just journal her symptoms and, what we were doing, what medications we were trying, what whole foods we were trying, all of those things. So I got into this habit of journaling, and it became kind of like my way to let things out and deal with what was happening with having a special needs child. So I kept up that process through all of these years. And then when I went through my own personal experience, even in the hospitals, I've been in a lot of hospitals, I would journal in those hospitals. And when I couldn't write, my wife bought me a little tape recorder, and I was able to record my thoughts. So in the end, when I decided to write my book, I had both written books, journals, and then I had my audio journals. And what I did was I sent all of those tapes out to a company in Los Angeles, California, actually, that transcribes scripts for the movie industry. And so I sent them this big box of cassette tapes and it came, boxes of paper. So it was wonderful because, the memory plays tricks on us. And if you don't capture what's happening in that moment, at least it's my experience, then it's not as authentic and real because, you've probably done these things in college or in high school where someone starts a story in the front of the room, and about the time it gets to the back of the room, it's completely different.
Yeah.
So I wanted to make sure that, and I interviewed people for the book as well, doctors and those that were involved in my journey.
And that was another fascinating thing, and that you checked everything, all of the details of what happened to you with other folks. You went and you asked them, you checked your medical records. That makes it incredibly compelling too. It's a firsthand account, really. And so I'm going to start with the night in January 2016 when you woke up, and maybe you weren't awake, you were having a heart attack, and Melanie rushed you to the hospital. So you're on the gurney, and all of a sudden you set up and you say the name Frosty, and then like you flatlined. So tell us who Frosty was.
Sure. So yes, that night is, my goodness, it's been 7 years now, but I can remember it like it happened yesterday. Mm-hmm. So what happened was that it was about 10:30, 11 o'clock at night, Carlene. All of a sudden, I started thrashing around in bed, screaming. You can imagine, right? My wife's asleep. She's confused. Maria's sleeping down the hall. And Melanie runs out of the room, doesn't know where this is coming from. She comes back in, turns on the light, and it's me. So she calls 911. The ambulance arrives quickly. Thank goodness the hospital is only 3 miles from my house. So they get me into the hospital. The ambulance driver knows I'm having a massive heart attack because I'm hooked up to whatever they hook you up. Now, I had already passed out from the pain in bed. I mean, the searing pain started in the back of my neck, and then I just started gasping for air, and I was out. So they get me into, this is, of course, my wife and the nurses. This is their account. I'm unconscious. They get me into the hospital. They put me in a room, and they give you whatever kind of medications, probably blood thinners, whatever kind of medications to keep me stable. And the cardiologist wasn't in the hospital. So the nurse turns to my wife and says, look, we've got him stable, and he should be okay until the cardiologist arrives.
Wow.
And as soon as the nurse said that, I had sprung forward on the gurney. And what my wife said was like a scene from the movie The Exorcist. I sprang forward on the gurney, almost as if somebody had grabbed my shirt and just pulled me forward with great force. And my eyes sprung wide open, and I screamed out the name Frosty. And I collapsed backward on the gurney, and that's when my heart went out. And I flatlined, code blue rang out through the hospital, and in rushed a team of doctors to start working on me.
My goodness.
So to give you that perspective, so Frosty was the nickname of my brother-in-law. And Frosty, unfortunately, who was about my age, I was 56 when this happened. And Frosty was going through a divorce, and it was around Christmas time, and he had one daughter in college. He had a business. He was a surveyor. And there were just a lot of things going on with Frosty. He had a history of drug addiction, but he had been clean for many years. He had a really bad anxiety disorder. And I guess, everything just culminated in that moment. And he decided to go out and, do some, whatever it was that he thought he was doing to blow off some steam, and got a hold of a very wicked drug called Flakka. It just drives you mad for like 45 minutes. And unfortunately, he came back. He was living in the upstairs bedroom of his parents' house, and he took his own life.
Okay.
So that's what I was curious about that part of the story, Carlene, is that when that happened, my wife and I live about 20 miles away from my in-laws. And my mother-in-law had called me. It was about 5:30 in the morning. She told me what happened. And she said, can you come to the house and go up in the bedroom and try to find a journal or something a note that would tell us why, Frosty had done this. And I never forget, I went up into that room. I counted it. It was 7 times I went up into that room. It was a rather gruesome scene. And I finally found a journal that I had given to the family. So it was kind of curious that, when I died, Frosty came to me.
My goodness. So let me read on page 9 of your book. After you flatlined, I'm going to read just the excerpt of what happened next.
Sure.
Medical records show that resuscitation procedures lasted for 20 minutes, including CPR, several defibrillator paddle shocks, and multiple doses of epinephrine, along with 4 amps of bicarbonate. I remained pulseless and unresponsive, the definition of flatlined. The doctors continued working on me, but I was not coming back. My organs started shutting down. I was rapidly reaching the point of no return, when it's pointless to continue because irreparable damage to the brain is occurring. So you were, right at death's door. And so tell me what happened next. You remember when I think what they did was your family actually called after they were, tried to resuscitate you. They called in a priest, and he administered extreme unction. Which tell us about that. Yeah.
Sure. So what happened was, yes, they could not resuscitate me. And finally, the cardiologist did arrive in the hospital, Dr. Bajwa, who's now a friend of mine. Dr. Bajwa arrived. He did an emergency catheterization up through my thigh, and he found the blockage in my widowmaker, the left ascending artery, and he put in 2 stents, but it was too late. I had got into cardiogenic shock, respiratory failure. So another doctor arrived, Dr. Carson, who intubated me. So there I was on the vent, and I had gone into a 4-day coma.
Wow.
So while I was in that coma, there were a number of doctors that were sent in to see if I were brain dead. How they do those tests, I have no idea. They called in. Actually, my wife called Maria's doctor. He's a very famous autism doctor, Dr. Jean-Renal Corbier, who came in and also did some tests on me to see if I were brain dead. But during this process, I'm originally from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. My oldest brother drove down. I was raised Catholic, and he called the local parish priest because it was very clear to everybody. The first 2 days, my medical records show that I wasn't making any progress. So the local parish priest came and anointed me with oil and ashes and what's called extreme unction. And extreme unction in the Catholic faith is you only get it once in your lifetime.
Wow.
And it's your last rites to where you're blessed, and they prepare your soul to meet the Lord. And so that was done.
Wow.
And then everybody walked away.
Wow. And let me back up a little bit to ask you about Dr. Patel.
Yeah.
So when you were basically they were working on you and for the 20 minutes, she was the attending physician at that point, and she would not give up. I mean, you write a beautiful passage in the book, just chilling, about how she went above and beyond any measures that, a lot of times they do she said, I just kept hearing, just keep, you can bring him back. You just keep working. And so the next day after you actually did wake up, which was actually, I think, a surprise really to a lot of the doctors, she came in and she talked to you. And tell me about what she said.
Yes, Dr. Patel, and she is, of course, it's the first time I'd ever seen her. She came to my bedside, and my arms were paralyzed for the first couple of days from, all the trauma. And she came to me. It was the second day out of coma. She came to me and she sat down and she said, I'm Dr. Patel. And she began to get very emotional. And she said, I wanted to tell you that I'm the one that worked on you that night, and I can't even believe that you're still here. And she started to tell me about all of the things that in her team that they did to try to, revive me. And then, Carlene, it got very personal. And I found that to be very strange because she began talking about her father. And she said, Rob, my father and I were very, very close. He helped me get through medical school. He could almost read my mind. And all he lived for was to see my first child. And she said, but 6 months before my son was born, my father had a brain aneurysm and he died suddenly. And she said, ever since that happened, I'm Hindu. I used to have a very rigorous spiritual life. And now she said, I've become very bitter and I don't feel that connection anymore to him or my own spirituality. And, but she says, maybe just seeing you alive, because you shouldn't be, maybe there really is something out there.
Wow.
And in that moment, it hit me. The first part of that experience was, and who knows when this happened. I don't know if it was when I was pulled off the gurney in some otherworldly manner when, I screamed out Frosty's name out of the blue and collapsed. I don't know if that's when Frosty came to me. But the first part of that experience was Frosty came to me and he said, I've made a big mess of things and you have to go back and help clean things up. But tell my parents I'm in a good place.
Wow.
That was the first part of that experience, which gave me great pause when I woke up, and we could talk about that.
Yes.
But it was when Dr. Patel came and sat down to me and started telling me this story that the puzzle unscrambled and it hit me, because what I'd been grappling with since I woke up was not only Frosty, but while she was working on me, I kept on hearing the same thing. A male spirit had entered the room and kept on saying, keep working on him. Don't give up. You can save him, over and over and over again. And it hit me that it was her father speaking through me and just encouraging her to continue to keep working on me. Because, as you say, 20 minutes dead, the brain should be dead. She should have called it, but they can't call it a long time ago and walked away.
Wow.
But she kept on working on me. So it was an extraordinary part of my experience. And I didn't have the courage to tell her that in that moment. It wasn't until a year later that I sat down and interviewed her that I told her the story.
That's wonderful. So let's talk about Frosty. So when you went to the other side, he was there and he talked to you about messing things up. But then it also made an extraordinary impression on you as far as your understanding, because you'd been raised Catholic, of sort of the act of suicide and what happens after a person commits something like that. So just tell me what you realized.
Yes, and I want to be clear, no offense to the Catholic faith.
Sure.
The Catholic faith was a great foundation for me.
Yeah.
My mother was, such a devout Catholic, and there's a part of that is still in me and that I cherish and love. But when I was raised, the Catholic Church taught us that suicide was a mortal sin, which meant there was no pass-go. You were going straight to hell, and it always scared the bejesus out of me that this loving God can condemn somebody. And here was my brother-in-law, the sweetest, most peaceful person you ever want to meet, who had an anxiety disorder and unfortunately went down that path of getting addicted to drugs to try to ease that anxiety. And I thought to myself, why would God condemn someone who, number one, isn't in their right mind? You can't be in your right mind when you decide to take your own life. It's impossible. So it was a huge paradigm shift in my belief that, hey, wait a minute, these are not the tenets of a loving God. These are the tenets, man-made rules that, for whatever reason, and that's no place in the Bible, that we get these things, and I don't know. It's one of the issues that I've always had with organized religions, not just the Catholics, because things can be taken out of context, and sometimes rules are made for whatever reason, and it's just kind of was a big eye-opening aha moment for me. And now that I look back, and I've thought about this even now, all these years, is that Frosty coming to me was such a gift because, number one, it's the only thing that's given his family peace to know that he was in a good place. And finally, he was in the peace that was emanating from him, and there was no anxiety there. None of his demons followed him into that place. He was just at peace, and it was a beautiful thing to experience him there. But not only that, Carlene, he's the one really that prepared me for what was going to happen while I was awaiting heart transplant.
Wow.
So
that's wonderful. So let's tell us about that, sort of that journey after you woke up, and, you know, what happened after that as far as your physical therapy, and it was fascinating.
Yes. Well, as you can imagine, so my heart was pretty much destroyed. So they did a couple of things. First thing they did was they fitted me in this defibrillator vest, which, they called it my little buddy that, my buddy that would rescue me every time my heart failed, which was often. So it was, this thing would shock you back to life. Talk about PTSD. So every time my heart would get weak, this thing would shock you. And they said, make sure that nobody's touching you when this happens. They can get electrocuted, and try to be in a safe place, because a lot of people just get knocked unconscious. So I had this battery pack on my right shoulder with this vest, and then they cut me here, and they put a port in me, and they were dripping this medicine called milrinone on my heart like every 60 seconds. And milrinone is a drug that my doctor said, think of it as like STP for the heart. So it makes the heart beat, but it starts the clock ticking because it wears the heart out really quickly. So I have another battery pack on my left shoulder with this, IV bag dripping medicine on my heart, and I'm walking around, like this cyborg creature from the Terminator or something, trying to survive and trying to find a heart. Wow. So that was an incredibly, incredibly difficult period of my life. And that lasted until I got to the University of Chicago Medicine, which was in April. Mm. So I had to wear those devices until I got there, and then started all of the pre-transplant testing and going through that whole process.
And then there was a frightening glitch before you were ready to get your heart transplant, and they came in and told you they had another diagnosis that they and tell us about that.
Yes, and before that, though, which was really interesting, when I got to Chicago, I'll never forget, I walked in, and my Dr. Uriel, who's no longer there, he went back to New York, but just a wonderful man who was in charge of the heart failure department at the University of Chicago Medicine. And Dr. Uriel saw me when I walked into the room, and he said, first of all, I have no idea how you're even walking around. But he said, there's no way you're going to survive until a heart comes, because you got to go through months of testing. We have no idea when a heart's going to arrive because they're in such short supply. And he said, so we're going to talk to you about this heart pump that our famous heart transplant surgeon, Dr. Juvenandan, has been working on for about 15 years. And I said, oh, what is this thing? So Dr. Juvenandan comes in, and he starts to talk to me about this heart pump that hasn't been used. And I said, well, so tell me about this thing. What is it? And he said, well, tell you what this is. He said, we're gonna fish this little balloon pump down through your aorta, and on the left side of your body, we're going to drill a hole and put this titanium disc under your rib cage, and the wires will come out there, attached to an iPad, which is going to run this pump. It's about the size of a lunchbox, and it's going to pump your heart while you're waiting for, a donor heart to arrive. And I said, wow, that's really fantastic, Doc. I said, how many people have had this thing? And he said, well, we've tested it on cows and pigs, So he said, I said, you mean like where steaks come from? Cows? So you're going to put this thing in me? And he said, well, we've had, one guy had it in him, and his heart arrived like the next day, so we took it out. But we need 3 weeks of data to take it to the FDA for human trials. And he said, but I'll tell you, Rob, he said, the condition you're in, you really don't have choice. So I signed the documents without my wife knowing about it, because she's a pharmacist and she knows all about medical trials, and they can go one way or the other. But I'll tell you, Carlene, it was the best thing I ever did. The new pulse, they installed this thing in me, and it was the first version of it. And every time this thing would, beat my heart, it was like boom, 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 boom. I'd be shaking.
Oh,
those nurses would come into my room and cry and say, "How do you sleep?" And I said, "I don't." But the new pulse now has been they've refined it, and it's a lot quieter. It doesn't jolt the body like that, and it's been a very successful bridge to transplant, which people all over the country have now, and they can actually go home with it and wait for their heart at home. So it's just a magnificent device, and I made medical history with it. So
that's wonderful.
Neat thing to do.
Yes.
So, but in this entire process of pre-transplant testing, months of this, they test you for everything in the world as you can possibly imagine. And there are certain things that disqualify you from getting a heart because they're in such short supply. The government won't allow it. And one of those things is cancer. So, and I don't talk about this a lot on podcasts, but I'm going to get a little more personal with you today. So they did find prostate cancer in me, and they took me off the transplant list. So that was one of my darkest times throughout the whole experience. So they told me that they would have to take me off the transplant list and revert to putting me in this thing called the LVAD. The LVAD is this horrifying device that they literally drill a hole in your heart and they put a motor in there. And it just spins your blood around. And, I researched it, and less than 30% of patients that get the LVAD ever survive to even make it to heart transplant because you have strokes, lots of infections. I mean, it's just awful. So I told Dr. Uriel, I said, "You're going to discharge me. I'm going to go home and walk on the beach and die naturally because you're not putting this thing in me." So he had become very close. He had an affection for my situation with my daughter Maria and everything that we had gone through. So he said, "Rob, if I find one other person in the country that has been transplanted with prostate cancer, I'll request from the government to create a new category for transplant. But you have to agree to have the prostate taken out, make sure you're cancer free, and then we'll transplant you." He said, if you can survive that long. So I agreed to all that. So that was the dark night of the soul.
Yeah.
In addition to that, I had gotten pneumonia in my right lung, so I was impaled with this tube, draining my right lung out. And then they thought I had a blood infection. It was just weeks of IV medications, and it was never thought that I would ever make it out of there alive, to be honest with you.
So tell us about your second near-death experience then. That was after that, right? I'm trying to remember exactly the chronology of the events.
Yes, you're exactly right. So as all of this was building, I had flatlined in January of 2016. It is now May, and I'm at the University of Chicago Medicine. I weigh about 174 pounds. I had wizened down to about 132 pounds. I was just a bag of bones. I was green. My oldest brother, Lou, came to see me, and he went home to his wife, Carol, and he said, "My brother's not going to make it. He looks like a wizened old man with the voice of a child." And it was in that period when they told me I wasn't going to get transplanted, and I'd just gone through all of this, these fevers and pneumonia and all this crazy stuff. And that's when it happened, Carly. There I was, and it's hard to explain this, but I was on the 8th floor of the University of Chicago Medicine, and I was overlooking Lake Michigan. And one night I was there completely worn out. I mean, after 20 years of dealing with my daughter's disabilities and everything that I had gone through in this whole journey, now they tell me I can't be transplanted. And there's this wicked storm that just whipped up off of Lake Michigan out of nowhere. And I mean, on the 8th floor next to the lake, it feels like you're in the middle of the ocean. And that storm whipped up and this lightning outside the windows and sheets of rain are banging on the window, and I'm in the room by myself and feeling sorry for myself. And worst thing that happened was all of a sudden it was almost like some evil entity had entered the room, reminding me of every mistake that I've made in my life. And all these negative thoughts started to overcome me. And I was almost like I was a magnet drawing in all this negative energy. And it just kept building to the point where I think I had an anxiety attack or something, because there it was, boom, my heart went into tachycardia. And I just cried out to just do with me what you will. And it was in that moment, and it's very difficult to articulate this, it's kind of inexplicable, but it was in that moment when I was taken up to a place that I call in the book the Ethereal. And the Ethereal, by the way, that chapter is the shortest chapter in the book, and it was the hardest chapter to write because there's really no language to explain these things. It took me 3 years to write the book, and I bet you it took me 6 months to write the Ethereal. But there I was, and all of a sudden, I found myself standing in the middle of nowhere. And it's hard to articulate. It was almost like, I say to people, the best way to describe it is when you're on an airplane, you're sitting on the window seat, and you're looking out, and it's a clear blue sky, and you're seeing everything, but you're really seeing nothing at all. And that was the first part of the experience. There I was, standing in the middle of nowhere, wondering what was going on. And I can see myself, I'm looking down, and I can see myself in my hospital bed, in my green hospital gown, just withering away. And I can also see like a hologram of myself standing in the middle of nowhere, perfect and whole, in the same hospital gown.
Wow.
And I thought, okay, this is an in-between place. It wasn't heaven, or my concept of heaven. And I remember thinking, particularly being raised Catholic, I remember being disappointed because my parents who had passed away didn't come to me. I didn't hear any, organ music. There were no angelic beings. It was just me standing in the middle of nowhere. But then, as soon as that happened, this peace came over me, this inexplicable peace came over me, and I just let myself go and experience being in that place, in this infinite expanse. And, for me, from my experience, the five senses had no functionality there. In other words, I couldn't smell, taste, or touch anything. I couldn't hear anything. But what had happened is that all of a sudden, to me, in that place, communication was kind of like telepathic and synchronistic. It was almost like thoughts were feelings, and I could think something, and the answer was given to me. And I could feel it and absorb it. So there I was, and it was almost like this unspoken language was being impressed upon my spirit. And that's when I heard it. That's when I heard, I am the power behind all things. I am omnipotent. This is the divine source. This is your real identity. And when I heard that, it was then that it was almost as if I became part of that expanse. And it was like the grains of my being were made of sand, and someone picked me up and just threw me across this infinite expanse. And when that happened, it was like all of this knowledge of the universe was being downloaded. And I understood everything in a flash. And it was like, oh, now I understand. It's only human beings that make this so difficult. And it was like this web of, and that was the most fascinating part. I saw and became simultaneously part of this incredible web of twinkling lights. And it was, the best way to describe this web is that it looked like trillions and trillions of neurons. And we know what neurons look like in the brain from science class. There's this nucleus, and then there's the dendrites and tentacles, and they all kind of weave together. And inside and then there's this nucleus, and that's what it looked like. And it was just this beautiful tapestry that extended into infinity, hanging on the ceiling of the universe. And it was impressed upon me that each one of those twinkling lights, each spark of light, was a quark. And these quarks are the smallest building blocks of matter that we know at this time. I mean, science is finding all the time, finding out new things. But I came to understand that those quarks of light were kind of like, it's hard to explain, kind of like there's several quarks, and these quarks combine and they create infinite possibilities in the universe. They could become a person, a blade of grass, a tree, a planet. And then it hit me that this is what God uses to create. And those quarks are made of light. It's the same recipe.
Yeah.
And I thought to myself, wow, God uses light to create, heal, and transform us. And it doesn't matter if it's an animate object or an inanimate object. The recipe's the same. It's light.
Wow.
And, when that revelation hit me, it was then that being part of that web, I understood that there was this universal language being spoken, and it was a message of unity and oneness, and that we were all connected. And I thought to myself, if we're all connected, how can we be lonely? Loneliness is just an illusion. How can I ever be lonely if I'm connected to everything? And then, Carlene, it was as I became connected to everything and I understood these concepts more and more, I thought to myself, if I hurt myself, I hurt everything connected to me. But if I love, the light will spread.
Oh, wow.
And I realized in that place that there were some parts of the web that were a little bit darker than others, and some parts of the web that were brighter than others. And I was placed upon my spirit things like, the power of a single act, things like this, which I really didn't explain. I couldn't understand in the moment. But later, I put all of these things together, particularly when I was writing and researching my book, and I started to understand how quantum physics works and how we're all connected and how all things were all made of the same cosmic stuff, as it were.
Yes.
That is so.
That's
that
beautiful.
Was the most incredible part of my experience.
My God, that is amazing, Rob. It takes your breath away. It's the sort of the meaning of existence, really, our existence.
Yes.
And so then when you came back, you tell us what happened with your heart transplant. That's an amazing, amazing story too.
So as when that experience ended, I'll tell you how the experience ended. So there I was, part of this web, and it's crazy. I began to see in that place, nurses coming in and out of patients' rooms. And there I was looking down on these nurses coming in and out of patients' rooms. And I was struck by how I had only seen the nurses that I had made negative assumptions about. And I remember thinking to myself in that place consciously, I thought I had evolved beyond judgment, but I guess I hadn't, because there I was seeing these nurses that I had made all these negative assumptions about, didn't have good feelings about. And the most fascinating part of that, Carlene, was that all of a sudden, on multiple television screens, I started to see their lives in a regression of events take place on these screens. And it was so fascinating to me because it was kind of like how a cartoon artist draws movement. They paint every movement of the character, and they flip those pages at high speed, and it creates movement. Well, as their lives were going backwards, every time something like a watershed event happened, like abuse or a bad personal choice or circumstances out of their control, that movie stopped for a second so I could see why they had become who they were. It was painting a portrait of why they were who they were. And in that moment, I thought to myself, how could you have ever judged these people so harshly? And then I had a life review of my own mistakes and the things that I was most ashamed of. And it was in that moment that I forgave myself. And I'll tell you, the power of forgiveness is an amazing thing, and I'll tell you why. It was then that out of that web came my daughter, Maria. And, in this temporal world, Maria is completely handicapped. She can't walk, talk, feed herself. She can't use her hands. She's completely disabled. And I've always had a very close spiritual relationship with Maria, and I've always known that that's not who she is. And there she was, standing in the middle of nowhere, perfect and whole. And she had this light emanating through her eyes. And it was not the kind of light that you and I see in the natural world. It was that spiritual light, the light that I was talking about from the divine that animates all life. And there she was, and I spoke to her in that unspoken language of the ethereal. And I said, Maria, I've never known your voice. I've never heard you say, I love you, Daddy. I don't know anything about your personality. I said, your mother and I have taken you everywhere to find a cure. We've given it all up. I said, just tell me, what is it that I can do for you when you're suffering, when you're having seizures? Tell me what to do. And she said 3 words that transformed my life. She looked at me and she said, just love me. And when she said, just love me, I cried out into that infinite expanse. I said, I never want to leave this place. And when I said, I never want to leave this place, I heard my own voice echo back to me. And there I found myself back in my hospital bed.
Wow.
And that was the end of the experience.
That is amazing. Wow. And so then you were left to readjust to the real world. I shouldn't say real world, to this realm.
To this realm, yeah.
And what was that like? That must have been really difficult. And then the surgery was ahead of you. And tell us a little bit about that.
Sure. So I tell you, the feelings that I had as soon as I came back into my bed and found myself in my bed, I was really bitter and angry about it. I mean, I wanted to be back there where my daughter was perfect and whole, connected to everything in peace. But I knew that I had to come back because just like I heard in the ethereal, those voices so clear and strong, I was in that bed and I was pleading with God, why did you bring me back? I know that you brought me back to help Maria and to get her through this and to the other side and to help my wife, Melanie. I said, but what has this been all about? All of this suffering and coming to this place, and now I can't get transplanted. And just one word was impressed upon my spirit, testify. And I knew that I would find the perfect heart. I knew then that I was going to live. No doctor had to tell me. And I knew that I would live to tell my story. And then I was at peace. And when I finally let go, the second time, I let go. And shortly after that, Dr. Uriel came into my room and he said, Rob, I think I've got the perfect heart for you. And it was on June 6th, 2016, that I was transplanted.
My gosh. Yeah. Isn't that amazing? It is incredible. And so, Rob, what lessons? Well, first of all, I want to just make a comment about your family. I was just touched all throughout the book at the way your family, your brothers, your sisters-in-law, your wife, and all the doctors just circled around you with such love and concern. And it's a testament to who you are, for one thing, because you're just an incredible human being. So, those things happen to people who have given all their life and they then receive. But your brother, it was just amazing to me. They came, they flew in, they got you an apartment in Chicago. It was really beautiful. So I just wanted to say that the whole book is so touching. It's just a story of love and it's, like I said, so well written, but that part always, when I would read about your family, I was like, this is really an incredible group of people. So I just, I want to say that. And
thank you. Thank you.
Yeah.
They really are. I mean, I couldn't have made it without them.
That's amazing.
Even Maria's caregivers at the time.
Yeah.
It seemed like we were in this time warp, this magical time warp where I had all of these incredibly spiritually evolved doctors.
Yeah.
People that now are friends of mine that were part of this journey. And it was just, when I think about it, this is why I coined the phrase in my book that coincidences are God's way of remaining anonymous.
Yeah.
And I really believe that.
Yes.
Because
yeah.
I don't know.
Right.
I don't know how else it could have happened.
Well, but you gave back to, like Dr. Patel, when you then a year later talked to her about her father. And I mean, that gave her such hope. Number one, that her father wasn't actually dead. He was just on another dimension and still with her.
Yeah.
And, those of us who have lost children, or we understand that. It's like, yes, they're still here, not on this dimension where they can reach out and, I think they can't touch us, but, it's like it's a realization, and it gives you such hope. So you were giving back from the very beginning. So, and so I want you to talk a little bit about those lessons that you've learned, that if I hurt someone, I hurt everyone. If I love someone, that love goes out. That's just another beautiful section throughout your book.
Yes, and Carlene, in this hour, we don't have time to talk about all the things that I experienced in that place, the Ethereal. There were so many lessons to unpack. Lessons like when I understood that God both expresses and experiences life through us. I thought, wow, of course, how else can it be? But I could tell you that what I've learned, some of these life lessons, what I've learned along the way is the brightest quarks, the brightest sparks of light that I saw in that web. I understand now that those are the ones that help to serve others. You see, that's when our light, that love, because the universal language that the Creator speaks is love. And if the Creator truly does express and experience life through us, and of course the Creator does, because the Creator is an invisible entity, it's spirit, then that's how the Creator experiences life. And if the Creator's love, then it's all about how we love one another. And I need to be clear, because a lot of people have called me out on podcasts and asked me, well, what happens when somebody does something horrible? Look, we have to be accountable for our own actions, period, end of story. I'm not saying anybody should be off the hook for doing something immoral or a terrible act of violence. Believe me, what I've learned is that web is a reflection of the light and dark struggle that humanity has been going through since the beginning of time. And what we do here matters because it affects our spiritual life. It's like a mirror. And when we do something here that weakens that light, it gets reflected in that spiritual realm and back and forth. So trust me, there's nobody gets off for free out of here, because somewhere along the line, and I don't know exactly, I'm not a theologian. I don't know exactly what that is, but maybe it's a distance from the Creator when you go into that spiritual realm. I'm not sure, but we have to be accountable for what we do here.
That's wonderful. So I just want to say in closing, this again is a beautiful book. And the last chapter as well, maybe we've just got a few minutes, but the last chapter that you talk about, the quantum and how, we're all connected is really amazing. I mean, it's information that I think quantum physicists have studied for, for a long time. And it's like you bring it all together in such a lovely way. So I'm going to have you just give us maybe a little synopsis of that last. And I would say to anybody, any viewer, the book is gorgeous. And that last chapter in and of itself is worth buying the book. And actually the whole book is just amazing. So what parallels have you drawn that you now read about quantum physics that you feel you saw in the ethereal?
Well, it's a good question because, as I was researching and writing the book, I began to look at some of the work by particularly some of the very young minds that understood this, in addition to Einstein, but, Max Planck and some of these other brilliant minds that have come through this state of consciousness and I began to see all of these parallels. What Einstein struggled with and what he finally understood before he left, he said, one of the things that mankind struggles with and one of the greatest illusions is that we're separate. And we're not. We're all one. We're all connected. And whatever that metaphor was with this web and these quarks, Carlene, and I talk about what the researchers at Northwestern University in Chicago discovered with the embryo, that when that sperm hits the egg, there's this bright flash of light called the zinc spark, and it takes place in all of creation. And they just discovered this a couple of years ago in the human eggs, but even in the animal kingdom. So even that bright spark of light shows up when we're first created. I don't know if it's the soul coming down and connecting, right? But it's everything now. Scientists and physicists are beginning to understand that light is the cornerstone for the basis of all of creation. Wow. And I was shown some of those things in my experience. I mean, what a gift to have seen that and to start understanding that and how we're all connected. And I can tell you, I know this for sure, that we're only going to find peace within ourselves and peace within our world when we come to understand that we're all from the same place. We come out of this divine web of love and light. And the more we express that light and that love through ourselves while we're here in this temporal world, in the physical realm, the more we'll evolve and the greater and more at peace the world will be. Because, you talked, and I'm going to finish with this, you talked a little bit about, we didn't get to it, about my transplant. So I was transplanted and I received the heart of a young 20-year-old girl. Mm-hmm. And, if heart transplant doesn't speak to the universality of humanity, nothing does, because, here we are. I mean, I'm of Italian descent. She was of German descent. I'm a baby boomer. She was a millennial. I like some of the foods that she liked now and some of the music that she liked. And my wife tells me I drive in the middle of the road now and I like M&Ms. I never liked junk food. So, crazy stuff. And I could tell you story after story of people on my floor that were transplanted and some of the things that they've gone through. It's because the heart, they found out, has its own brain. And the heart communicates with the brain in 4 ways. And interestingly enough, and this goes back to quantum physics, the most incredible way that the heart communicates with the brain and with other beings is through this electromagnetic field that the heart generates, which comes out at about 100 feet in radius from all of us. And it's where our intuition comes from. And it's where we sense other people's energy. So when you go to a party or you go somewhere and someone walks into a room and you say, I can feel that person's energy, it's good or bad, it's coming from the heart. It's coming from what's on the inside. And it's how we communicate with each other and animals without language. So it's all about the heart. And, the heart is all about love. All these aphorisms that have been in the collective consciousness of mankind throughout our humanity, talking about, follow your heart, broken heart, achy heart, all of this stuff. It's all about the heart, and there's a reason for it, because the heart is at the center of all of this. It's not just an organ. So the heart is the first thing to develop in a woman's womb. It's not the brain. Everybody's got it backwards.
Really?
It's the heart that pumps the blood and oxygen and nutrients to the rest of the body, including the brain. So this relationship starts very early on, and it carries through. There's memory in the heart. There's all of these things in the heart. And that's why heart transplant works.
That is just beautiful. Oh, God. Rob, thank you. You are just an amazing human being. And this book is so beautiful. I really hope that all of the listeners today will go out and buy it. It's called Quirks of Light. We're going to have more about it, in the as we close, so people can find the book and any other maybe speaking things that you're doing. And I am so delighted to have you as one of our very first guests. This was so moving and yet incredibly brilliant and informative. So thank you so much, Rob, and the best of luck to you and Melanie and Maria. And we just send you our very best. Okay.
Thank you so much, Carlene, for having me. It's been a lovely hour. Appreciate it so much.
Thank you. Thank you for joining me for my interview with Rob Gentile. If you'd like to know more about Rob's work, go to my website, www.haveyoueverwonderedpodcast.com, and open the link that says guests.
Have you ever wondered? Ever